Good morning, class. Today we're going to be setting up a development environment using GitHub Codespaces. And the benefit of this approach is it will allow us to set up our development environment, get everything installed that we want, and have that configuration tied directly to our repository so that as we work on a team, everybody in the team will have a code space where they can develop that is identical to everybody else's. So everybody is working from the same basic development environment with the same repository, which helps eliminate a lot of the challenges that we've traditionally had in team-based development where everybody's running on a slightly different machine with their development configuration slightly different, and that can cause all kinds of headaches when we start trying to pull it together. So let's shift our attention to how to do this. We're going to start today by just creating a brand new repository with nothing in it, and then we're going to start contributing to that directly from GitHub. And I know this is not how you've normally used repositories. Normally you create them locally on your own machine, and then you commit your code and you create a GitHub repo to go with it, or else you're accepting a GitHub classroom assignment. So this is another different workflow you can use with GitHub. So we're going to create a new repository, and I'm going to call this one Hello Container, because this is our introduction to dev containers, and then later on we'll also use this one to explore using Dockerized containers as a deployment tool. And I'll go ahead and make this a public one so you can get in and look at my repository if you're curious. You'll want to go ahead and do the same thing. I will go ahead and create this. I'll go ahead and throw a README in there. So this, normally if you did this, this creates a repo and puts an initial file in there, a README file. So we wouldn't be able to hook it up to an existing repo. It is now its own repo, which is okay. Now we have our repository. We want to set this up to be a code space, and actually it already is. If we go here to code, you've used this local tab probably a lot to find the link that you need to clone your repository locally. But this code spaces allows us to fire up a code space on main or on any other branch. So as you're working on a team and you have your own branch, you'd probably open that branch rather than main. And by default, what this is going to do is this is going to open up a code space for general development, and it's going to have support for working with Docker. It's going to have support for working with Node and a lot of other common tools, Python and whatnot. What it does not have support, though, for is ASP.NET development. Those libraries are not pre-installed on the default container. So in order to get those, we're going to have to change from using the default configuration to using a custom configuration. And we'll want to add a file to do this. So we'll go to create new file. We can always create files and edit files directly on GitHub. You probably haven't done much of that, but it is something that the user interface will allow as long as we have right access to this repository and we're logged in. And what we want to create is a directory called dev container, and inside that we want dev container.json. And this is going to be a JSON file, which means it starts with a bracket, ends with bracket, and inside of this object, this JSON object we're defining, we can give any kinds of information we want about how we want to work with this dev container. So the first thing we want is we need an image. And an image is really just a serialized file system. So you take a hard drive and you just serialize all of its contents. That's an image. That's really what it is. And we use images to write CDs, we use them to write DVDs, and we use them to create containers and virtual machines. So in this case, we're using this to create a container, which is essentially a emulation of a computer running with that file system and whatever's pre-installed on it, which usually is going to be an operating system, and then whatever kinds of development tools we want. And if you go to the Docker Hub and look at what .NET publishes, these are the different ones they publish. The .NET SDK is what we want to use for development. So we can jump in and take a look at what they have there. And notice they have a couple different tags. 6.0 is under long-term support. 7.0 is under normal support. we could use either one of these. And there are also different versions of this, Bookworm, Bullseye, Alpine, which are using different versions of Linux as their underlying flavor. And some of those are going to be stripped down. Some of those are going to be larger. And you can see there's quite a lot of options there. Now, when we do that, we're going to use this address as really what we're after here. So this is the piece that we care about. The Docker pull is the command you would use if we're doing this directly in Docker. We are actually using the link to the repo, but we're not using it directly with Docker. GitHub is using Docker under the hood. So we want to use that mcr.microsoft.com.net SDK. I'm going to use version 6.0, the long-term support version. Who knows? And just actually, .NET 8 is almost out, so that you may want to switch depending on which version you're wanting to run. I'll go ahead and use this because I'm more familiar with it. And that's really all we have to do to set up our dev container. So if I save this, commit those changes, then I can go back to my top level. And now if I go to this code and I create that code space, it's going to use the configuration I put in that dev container. So it's going to be loading for us an image that's provided by Microsoft instead of the default Docker dev container configuration, which means now we can actually use the .NET command line tool. Now we've got it up and running. We can come into our terminal and notice this opens by default. This is actually Visual Studio Code, the online version, which is pretty much identical to the desktop version. So you see some familiar tools along the side. You have your file tree. We have our editor window. And then we also have this terminal, which is just a Linux terminal, and we can do all our .NET commands here. So, for example, we could create a new Razor project. I'm going to try to put it in the source directory, and I'm going to say no HTTPS, because I don't need HTTPS support in this case, and that's included by default. So if we run that, you can see that it created a source directory, and it put a .NET project in there. So this computer, which is running underneath this VS Code instance, actually already has .NET pre-installed because that was the image we specified. And we can go ahead and run that if we want and build that with the command line tool. So .NET build, and of course we have to specify where that solution or project file is we want to build, which is in our source directory. And I need to spell build correctly. If I do that, notice it's going out, it's doing the restoration, it's building the project, and our build succeeded. I can also do a .NET have to use the right flag. The other thing I can do is just change into the source directory, which makes sense. Notice this toast message that popped up right here tells me that I'm running an import, and I can open that in a new browser tab. So this is an ASP.NET web application. Boom, I can go in, I can see exactly that running as we would expect. I'm going to show you one more trick. .NET watch, which takes the same arguments as run. And this allows for hot reloading. So now this is running the project, and if we make any changes, it's going to automatically reload those. So I can go ahead and just refresh this page, or I could reopen it. Notice that it's going to still be hosted right there. And if I come into my source code for this project, and let's look in the pages, and we will make a change to our index.cshtml. And I'm going to change this welcome message to give a greeting from myself. If I refresh the page, the server is still running. It's done a hot reload of the code. So now it's going to display those changes. This is a very easy way to develop web applications or really any kind of application, but definitely works really well for web apps. And notice that all we really had to do was set up this one dev container file, and we had our full development environment ready to go. And we could do even more with that. We can modify this to have additional support. Say, for example, we want to enable the .NET tools. And you notice it says, you want to install the recommended C# tools down here. We could do this every time we run the project, or this particular code space, but we can also pre-build that into our customization, saying, hey, I just want that pre-installed so that whenever I launch this code space, I have those development tools. So we go into customizations, and then VS Code, and inside of that, we can go extensions to say I want some extensions pre-installed. The particular extension we want is MS. Let's see. And actually, I'll go look at that extension they are suggesting. There it is. There's the identifier. That's the one we want. So we're going to copy this, and we're going to drop it in this dev container as an extension. So customizing VS Code, adding an extension, and this is an array, so we can have as many extensions as we want. This is just the generic C# tools. If we save that, let's go ahead and break out of this. The other thing we really want to do to make this work for us is we also need to add a gitignore, and that needs to go at our top level. I'm going to click on the README just to get to the top level. And we need a C# gitignore, one that's specifically for .NET. You can just Google that. And this is one of the standard ones. We can just go ahead and grab the raw file here, select everything on it, copy all of that, drop it into our gitignore, save that change. And if we run our git status, notice that we have new files because we've created our source directory with all of the Visual Studio project files. We've added the gitignore, and we've modified our dev container. So we can go ahead and just do a git add period to add everything, git commit am. We're going to say what our message is, initial application setup for development. And if we do a git push, that's going to push it back to the repo that we cloned it from, which again was our GitHub repo. So if I go back to that initial repo and refresh this, we're going to see a lot of additional files pop in. So we now have a development environment, and when anybody on our team comes to this development environment, if they go to this code and bring it down to Codespaces, they can open up their own development code space, which is in parallel to the one that we are using. Those are completely separate. It's on a per user basis. We can actually have more than one of them if you had some reason you wanted to have more than one. You can also open them for specific branches. And notice too here that it's flagged as active. That means that this is around. If I were to close this tab and come back a day later and look here again, it would show me that that's still there. It's just inactive, and I could actually relaunch it and come back in, and it would be exactly where I left it. Now, be aware that code spaces that are inactive for too long of a period of time do get deleted. And that means that any changes you've made in that code space go away. So if you want to keep any changes you make a commit, push it back to the repository. And because you're working on teams, you'll want to do that on a team basis. So each person should have their own branch. So rather than working on the main branch, you should be pushing to your own branch to keep your changes safe. And then at some future point where you feel comfortable with that and you think my code is ready to be added to the main project, you're going to pull from main, fix any changes, any problems that occur because of that, and then you're going to push back to main. And that is really the way that you want to do that. The other way you can do it is through pull requests. That's up to your team as to how you want to handle merging changes into the main branch, but you do need to be cautious about doing that. You don't want to break the build for everybody else on the team. That is very poor behavior. Okay, that gets us a dev container. Next time, we'll talk about setting up a Docker image from this project that we've just built.